Out of the past, a secret plan to lock up thousands of Canadians whose crime was their support for radical ideas. From the Fifth Estate and Radio-Canada, revelations about a program so draconian it even shocked a politician supposedly in charge of it.
I'm just appalled to hear that. I just can't believe that that had any government authorization behind it.
We're just after 12:30, and I'm your host today, Stefan Christoph.
A tale of paranoid security from yesterday that resonates for activists today.
CSIS, knocking on the door, pushing themselves into the apartment, insisting on speaking to my friend.
This is the public face of national security. A public show of force. The power of the state deployed to maintain public order, calculated to impress and, if necessary, frighten. But this is mostly theater. Today and throughout history, the real security is going on unseen and frequently unsupervised. And when it goes too far, as we will see tonight, it can be exponentially more frightening than any public spectacle. Good evening and welcome to the Fifth Estate. I'm Lyndon McIntyre. Our story tonight is about the work of national security you hardly ever hear of, let alone see paraded ostentatiously in the street. It's work conducted for the most part by undercover cops and spies. It's about a shocking program that we'd never heard about until recently, a secret scheme that was in place for more than 30 years. It's a story about how people in authority were prepared to use fear to justify repression in the name of public safety. It was 1950, peacetime, but war was high on the agenda of a secret gathering in Ottawa. Government officials are briefed by senior officers of the RCMP, then the leading agency of national security. They have a plan of breathtaking audacity. In the event of a crisis, a preemptive strike against people deemed to be the enemies of Canadian democracy. 5 years earlier, this man, Igor Guzenko, had fled the Soviet embassy in Ottawa with files revealing a sophisticated communist spy network throughout the United States and Canada.
You are Mr. Igor Guzenko?
That's right.
And you are the man who exposed part of the Canadian Soviet espionage system in 1945?
That's correct.
Guzenko and the hood he wore in public seemed to offer confirmation that the world was full of sinister conspiracies, that the communists had fanatically faithful friends in Canada, and that the world was but a blink away from another global war. By the early 50s, the doomsday scenario was easy to believe. The outbreak of war in Korea looked like a rehearsal for World War III, which would be a war between democracy and Soviet dictatorship, a war with the potential to annihilate the human race.
The communists were elusive and hard to find, and the Canadians were given the task of chasing after them.
The prospect of a war that could be fought with nuclear weapons gave renewed legitimacy to espionage.
Well, there was a very great fear of the war between the Cold War becoming a hot war again. You know, it was very intense.
Robert Kaplan, who would one day become Canada's Solicitor General, officially the Minister of Spies, came of age in the Cold War era.
The atmosphere was so different in those days. You know, the public was scared of a communist threat.
Fear can generate extreme reactions. An American politician named Joseph McCarthy shrewdly demonstrated in the early 50s that the fear of communists had huge political potential.
Another general who protects communists is not fit to wear that uniform, General.
The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
The American public for years would tolerate the public persecution of people tainted with the accusation that they were communists or soft on communism.
I remember in my high school back in the early 50s, we'd come to school and we'd sit in our classroom and listen to the McCarthy hearings on the radio.
Whether you are or have ever been a member of the Communist Party.
Horror with a very strong disapproval. We just thought it was wrong.
If Kaplan was alarmed by what was happening in Washington, he'd have been appalled by what was going on at home. In August 1950, it would turn out that Canadians were no less vulnerable to fear. As Canadians nervously observed the unfolding public witch hunt in the U.S., the government of Canada approved a secret and potentially more menacing assault on civil liberties. The plan was called Pro-Funk, targeting prominent functionaries in groups believed to be pro-Soviet. It was a strategy of breathtaking ambition, the targeting across the land of people with communist affiliations, sympathies, even family connections. And it was approved in its broadest outlines by the Government of Canada. It was the brainchild of the RCMP Commissioner, Stuart Taylor Wood. He'd led the National Police Force for 13 tough years, from 1938 through World War II till the spring of 1951. He had a not surprising interest in national security and a preoccupation with identifying and, if necessary, neutralizing spies. This is a letter to the Minister of Justice in February 1950. The Commissioner sets out his master plan: to spy on and, when necessary, to intern 16,000 suspected communists and maybe even 50,000 of their sympathizers. Internment. It's a word with a lot of nasty baggage, most of it derived from excesses in distant places: South Africa, Siberia, the ghettos of Eastern Europe. Canada has its own dark history of internments: Ukrainians, Italians, Japanese, Canadians, in the early 40s, communists. But Pro-Funk was unique in Canada, not just for its scale, but for targeting Canadians for political beliefs that were legal. To this day, the lists of potential internees compiled by the RCMP remain a secret. But we now know that it didn't take much to get on the list of targets: party membership, family connections, associations that suggested sympathy for Marxist doctrine qualified thousands of Canadians for indefinite incarceration. And from documents we've seen, we can for the first time identify the types of people that the Mounties had in mind. Robert Mendel Laxer made no secret of his politics. He was a communist, a full-time organizer for the Labour Progressive Political Party, a legal entity in Canada. He lived with his wife and 3 young children on a quiet, dead-end street in a working-class Toronto neighbourhood. Growing up, the son of a committed communist wasn't always easy. James Laxer, Robert Laxer's son.
I'm about 10, 11. And the teacher, she says, today we're going to do a very exciting thing. We're going to all learn what each other's fathers do for a living. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do? Maybe recess will come along. She'll never get to me. She finally gets to me, and I stand up, and, Jimmy, what does your father do for a living? And I say, I don't know.
He might have said his dad had been a soldier, served overseas in World War II. But above all else, Dad was a Red, and it bothered him.
It felt awful. First of all, I was very adept at figuring out, even as a child, that while there was clearly support for the Communist Party in downtown Toronto in this period, that most people hated the Communist Party. I knew that. That Canadian politics at the federal level, in my opinion, is dysfunctional.
Jimmy Laxer grew up to become a prominent academic and author and a committed social democrat. He has no time for communist ideology or rhetoric, but he still has traumatic memories of childhood among communists in a time of strident anti-communism.
I felt deeply threatened. I felt that the world I lived in was a very insecure world. The message was and I got this from by the time I was 3 or 4, was that the police were bad. The police were our enemy. The police were out there to do us harm.
In fact, the police were never far away, something that his parents would have realized intuitively. Did they ever overtly suggest to you that you got to be careful out there, that we are in a very precarious position, we are probably being watched, we are being listened to, we are being monitored, and we could be snatched at any time? Did they ever give you that?
They didn't. They gave me the feeling that all those things were true without saying you have to worry about that or you have to watch. They didn't specifically say that. But the message was very powerful.
When we come back, a message more sinister than his parents realized.
This shocks the hell out of me, to hear that this was actually in place. I didn't know that.
It was called Pro-Funk. The targets prominent functionaries of groups with communist affiliations. This is what would happen all across the country in the event of international hostilities. Special teams in uniforms would show up in residential neighborhoods, take up tactical positions, await a signal from a designated control center. When that signal came, they'd move toward the target houses and their unsuspecting occupants. This is a story about national security. It's about a time when Canada was willing to strip thousands of unsuspecting Canadians of basic rights in the name of public order. It was a plan for mass internments, and it was kept alive for more than 30 years. Casa Loma in Toronto, a tourist landmark symbolic of an era of optimism and extravagance. What is less well known, it was once a designated prison for people deemed to be disloyal. Robert Laxer and his family lived just a few blocks from Casa Loma in the 50s. By all appearances, a typical Toronto family. The Laxers always knew that as communists they were being watched, but they couldn't have imagined that there was also a plan in place to lock them up. Communists and sympathizers in Toronto would be herded onto buses and confined at Casa Loma. They'd later be dispersed to more conventional detention in penitentiaries. After more than 50 years, we were able to provide Jim Laxer with details of that extraordinary national security initiative called Pro-Funk. And there was a plan in place to round up active communists, people in organizations.
You are, to some extent, scaring the hell out of me, but I'm not that surprised.
But let me tell you how specific it is, Jim.
Okay, okay.
You know where you guys, where your dad and mother, who was just as red as your dad.
Absolutely.
You know,
very proud of
you know where they were going to be put?
No.
Casa Loma. A couple of blocks away from home.
Yeah. They were going to be put in Casa Loma.
Yeah, and so were you.
You mean as a kid?
As a kid, and your brother and sister.
This shocks the hell out of me, to hear that this was actually in place. I didn't know that. It shocks the hell out of me because when you say it to me, I feel a kind of anxiety that brings back the anxiety that I felt as a kid.
That the plan was never implemented is of small comfort to one who might have been a target. The details are revealing of a mindset that, unchecked, could overnight unravel hard-won civil rights. Here's what could have happened. Men would be interned in camps across the country. Women would be confined in one of two facilities. Children would be either farmed out with relatives or interned with their parents. The bland numbers represented people, catalogued and filed and with bureaucratic diligence updated by the RCMP Security Service for decades. In Ontario alone, the lists in 1953 included more than 2,000 men and women either approved or awaiting approval for internment in a time of crisis. In Manitoba, one of 600 targeted subversives was this man, Jacob Penner, a prominent city politician in Winnipeg who also happened to be a longtime communist. Jake Penner was a founder of the Communist Party of Canada. Sat on city council for nearly 30 years. His life was an open book. And still, for most of it, he was spied upon as a subversive. It started as far back as 1919 when he lived here. He had frequent visits from a man he believed to be a friend and a fellow socialist. Jake once told the so-called friend he knew that he was being spied upon. "I know a spy when I see one," he claimed. Obviously not. The friend, codenamed Agent 50, was in fact a spy for the police. In the 1940s, policemen would raid the Penner home.
I don't know what the heck they were looking for. Dangerous literature. They wouldn't know dangerous literature if it hit them on the head.
Roland Penner is Jacob Penner's son.
Was he a dangerous man?
No, absolutely not. You know, he had the slightest intention, either singly or jointly with others, of overthrowing the state by force and violence. That wasn't his character, that wasn't his mode, that wasn't his belief.
Roland Penner followed his parents' political footsteps, became a leading communist in Manitoba, and like his parents, a subject of intense police surveillance. He'd later discover just how intense when he got to see his security files.
You have got a fairly voluminous file delivered to you, and you mentioned 80% of it is blacked out. Any way of figuring out what it is they didn't
Well,
want
yeah,
you?
it's all the stuff that would tell me or anybody else who the informants were. That's what that's all about.
Have you any idea who the informants were?
I have some ideas, none that I can state here publicly because they're only impressions, inferences.
In the dossier, is there any reference to something called pro-funk, P-R-O-F-U-N-C?
I don't even know what that means.
So we told him, based on documents we've been able to access. In the event of a perceived national emergency, there would have been a call to police detachments all across the country. It would signal the beginning of what they called M-Day, Pro-Funk Mobilization Day, the beginning of a massive roundup of political activists.
Attention all detachments. Attention all detachments. This is a level 1 emergency.
Immediate red Pro-Funk at 0600 hours, June 2nd. Repeat. Immediate red
Pro-Funk at 0600 hours, June 2nd.
Police commanders had secret briefings to prepare for M-Day. At each detachment, sealed envelopes, procedures to be followed, and the names of people to be picked up and detained. The orders were impressive for their bureaucratic detail. We now know those secret envelopes were thick with forms they blandly called C-215s, arrest documents called apprehension orders, precise details on specific targets, their ages, photographs, physical descriptions, information about their cars and their houses, with particular attention to potential exits for escape. There were obviously thousands of them. Among them, this C-215 document authorizing the arrest of Jacob Penner, an elected city councillor in Winnipeg for 27 years. There was a separate order for his wife, Rose Penner. When we come back, questions about how far the long arm of pro-funk extended. They were called the Pro-Funk Files. secret dossiers on citizens considered risks to national security dating back to 1950. It was still an active part of the security apparatus in 1968, when, according to this document, an advisory committee on internments was still reviewing pro-funk files. Files that may well have included one of the most influential politicians in the history of Canada.
In a Medicare program, in adequate health services for every man, woman, and child, irrespective of their income, their age, or their physical condition.
Tommy Douglas, former Premier of Saskatchewan, the father of public health care, and eventually this.
The greatest Canadian as decided by you is...
Tommy
But as a tireless advocate for social reform, Douglas was a likely target for a different kind of recognition. Security surveillance. What the Mounties might have learned, we can't confirm. Nearly 25 years after his death, much of his security file remains off limits.
Jerusalem.
What is available confirms that the Mounties spied on Tommy Douglas for more than 30 years, with particular attention to connections to the peace movement and the Communist Party. Was he one of thousands of Canadians who were deemed worthy of internment in the event of international hostilities? We may never know for sure. The present-day security establishment is insisting that most of Tommy Douglas' files remain secret indefinitely. Secrecy, they say, is intrinsic to security matters. But we've been able to come up with one tantalizing document, an intelligence report based on a 1954 newspaper story with this handwritten reference, C-215. We know that C-215 refers to a detention order, a key part of Ottawa's internment plan for arresting communist sympathizers. And one of the names underlined in this supposedly incriminating document is that of Tommy Douglas. Maybe inconclusive evidence. But in another file, on another subject of police surveillance, an identical marginal reference led us to confirm the existence of an apprehension order for Roland Penner, the son of Jacob and Ruth Penner, who were also targets for possible internment. Roland Penner, like his parents, was a communist, ran for election in the 50s, which earned him his own C-215 detention document that was regularly updated for at least 20 years. Roland Penner would later join the NDP, and when the party formed the government of Manitoba in the 80s, he'd be sworn in to serve as Attorney General of the province.
I'm sitting in front of the former Attorney General of the province, and I have in my lap draft detention orders for you, your first wife, possibly your children, parents. Draft detention orders that were constantly updated. How long do you think the active surveillance of you by the Mounties continued?
I've reason to believe, and I say that without being able to do anything more than make an inference from the dossier, that it continued even when I was Attorney General. Now, when it stopped, I don't know.
Does the dossier...
Lyndon, I have to advise you, it may not be stopped now. You may be under surveillance yourself.
From a security perspective, Jim Laxer, like Roland Penner, might also have been dangerous. He grew up in a dangerous environment under the influence of committed communists.
Morning.
Laxer and Penner met for the first time recently to compare experiences living in the shadow of internment.
You look like your father.
And you look like your brother.
They knew nothing about pro-funk until we showed them documents outlining plans for the pickup and detention of individuals like them.
Now, Manitoba, you had 161 RT men. That's, you know, enough evidence for pickup. And for women, you had 37, sufficient evidence for pickup. So this is so clearly, I mean, the thing is aimed right at us. I mean, this is Manitoba, Winnipeg is aimed at you, and Ontario, Toronto is aimed at my family.
Police, open the door! Police, ouvrez la porte!
Based on the explicit details of the documents, we can credibly imagine what could have happened. The precise instructions for the raids and the arrests. What is truly shocking is how much we learn from the particulars of how prospective internees would be treated. They'd be under military control, subject to stringent regulations, not allowed to speak to one another without permission from their guards. Page after page of rules with harsh consequences for infractions. Up to 3 days on a bread and water diet. And should they try to leave, they could be shot. Times change. Our insecurities evolve. By the 70s, the bogeyman of communism was replaced by the specter of homegrown terrorism. The October crisis in Quebec in 1970 provokes another startling authoritarian display.
At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that? Oh, just watch me.
Under the War Measures Act, nearly 500 people are swiftly rounded up from lists provided by the security establishment. Jean-Paul Brodeur took part in a subsequent review of police activity during the crisis in Quebec. Before he died recently, he confirmed for Radio-Canada that some arrests in October 1970 were based on lists of communists, possibly those pro-funk lists, made available to Quebec police.
Ils se sont mis en contact avec la GRC et ils ont été au quartier général de la GRC à cette époque-là, qui était rue Sainte-Catherine. Ils étaient dans une petite pièce et les gens de la GRC allaient dans une autre pièce et revenaient avec des dossiers qu'ils ne leur donnaient pas vraiment à lire, mais leur donnaient des noms.
It would come as a surprise to Daniel Waterloo to find himself among the separatists.
Tiens, je suis ici.
Yeah.
Ouais.
Waterloo was definitely an old-school communist, an admirer of international revolutionaries, Lenin, Che Guevara. But he had no sympathy for terrorism.
The FLQ, we didn't agree with bombings. It's not the way to change the world. And our principle is of changing society with the people, not against the people. If you blow bombs and you kill the neighbor's daughter, you're not going to have the woman to support your activity. It's not right. It's not the correct way.
But Waterloo was swept up anyway, spent months in jail and never quite knew why, until now. We've been able to confirm for him that he'd been a long-standing candidate for internment under the pro-funk operation. Daniel Waterloo was one of those thousands of Canadians for whom an apprehension order, a C-215, had been prepared and filed away for use in an emergency. Radicals, whatever cause they advocate, end up on lists. Secret lists are among the basic building blocks of national security. The trouble with lists is that the people who end up on them rarely know about them, or what the people who record their names ultimately do with them, who they share them with. And we can never know for sure what impact being on a list might have on a life or on a livelihood. There was little doubt back in the 60s that Martin Loney would end up on a list. He was a student radical in British Columbia. Even when he later took a job in government, he wound up on another list, as he recently discovered.
Of more concern, however, is the presence within certain government departments and agencies, particularly CMHC, of a small group of former campus revolutionaries. This group was led until recently by Martin Loney.
This is a letter from a minister, prepared with input from the RCMP.
Loney has returned to the United Kingdom to accept a teaching position, but his disciples remain. This is deranged nonsense. I mean, the idea that people would be my disciples.
The letter identified more than 20 civil servants as Martin Loney's radical disciples, what they called an extra-parliamentary opposition, some of whom to this day prefer not to be identified. Robert Rabinovich has no problem being outed. Then a Privy Council bureaucrat in Ottawa, he would survive the stain of having been formally identified as a potential threat. But he still has no idea how he got that designation in the first place. Who was Martin Loney?
I never met him. I've never had any contact with Martin Loney. I knew of him. He was a legitimate radical. And he went on, from what I know, to university and was a radical force in university. But he wasn't a threat to the state.
Rabinovich went on to senior jobs in the public service, including a stint as president of the CBC.
That the conditions do not build on our strengths, such as news and current affairs.
But even now he finds it sobering to think about the potential impact of an unsubstantiated allegation.
It scares me that somebody would sign it. I'm sure it was drafted by the RCMP at the time. It scares me that a minister would sign it. It is one thing for the state, through its agencies, to look into people who may be a threat to the state. It's another thing to understand the difference between a threat to the state and legitimate disagreement.
When we come back, new times, new threats, new targets. Pro-funk, brainchild of a war mentality. Initiated in 1950, it was a plan for a massive roundup of left-wing radicals in the name of national security. The program would eventually die of old age in the 80s, mercifully put to sleep by someone who didn't even know that it existed.
I, Robert Philip Kaplan, do solemnly and sincerely promise and swear.
Bob Kaplan became Canada's Solicitor General in 1980. He was a Liberal MP from Toronto. He started getting calls from irate constituents, old-timers getting turned back at the U.S. border. Something about security.
And so some of these elderly people were, because of things that had happened in their past, working maybe for a communist newspaper in Toronto or being involved in the labor movement or whatever, had resulted in them being identified as a threat to the national security, and they weren't being admitted to the United States because of that.
There were enough complaints that he decided to raise the issue with the RCMP. As Solicitor General, the force was under his jurisdiction.
Well, they were saying that one of the people on the list was invited to come to Moscow to some type of annual conference, and he was invited by the embassy to go, and that this kind of proved that there was still a little bit of life left in this threat to our national security. And I remember the commissioner and I sort of looked at each other.
In 1983, he finally instructed the Mounties to stop whatever they were doing that was causing border hassles for superannuated communists and lefties. What he didn't realize was that his instructions would effectively kill a 33-year-old program that he was unaware of until we told him.
I'm just appalled to hear that, and I just can't believe that that had any government authorization behind it. And I'm very proud that my name is on the order to shut that program down.
The Pro-Funk plan, with its mass arrests, its draconian detention, its orders to shoot people, seems so quaintly yesterday. But there's nothing yesterday about national security. It's everywhere today. In the 50s, it was communism. Today, it's radical Islam. It's assorted liberation movements, freelance anarchists. In the 50s, it was mostly the Mounties watching. Today, it's the RCMP, CSIS, and more than 20 departments and agencies of government with so-called national security responsibilities. It's an eclectic list. Border services and CSIS, not surprising. But how about Health Canada, food inspection, heritage, revenue, They're all engaged in the collection and the storage and the exchange of information about Canadians, often without oversight. Ian Ferrier, a musician and poet who lives in Montreal, got a recent glimpse of how the system works. It began earlier this year with a knock on his front door. The visitor was from CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service.
I asked him, you know, why are you here? And that's when he said he was asking about my friend Stefan.
Stefan Christophe.
Yeah.
Stefan Christophe is 29 years old, but he's part of a tradition as old as the idealism that has always motivated radicals. He writes for alternative media, does research for assorted clients. He shows up at demonstrations. He's a veteran of street politics.
They are basically denying the right for people to move freely across national borders.
He supports a wide range of causes very publicly.
Voices must be heard!
That's the whole point of dissent, being seen and being heard, and being fearless.
He says police hit him with a steel baton.
So why would CSIS have to spy on him?
I think that the majority of people in Canada do not agree with a government-funded agency spying on Canadian citizens who are involved in democratic activity, period.
Christophe moved to Montreal 10 years ago. He and Ian Ferrier bonded over music and political causes. What were the questions like?
Well, I guess the one that he kept coming back to is Stefan violent in any way?
Is Stefan violent?
Yeah, that's what.
And your answer was?
Well, I mean, hell, he could babysit my kids. He's not a violent man. He's the opposite of that.
So there was never a moment of doubt, oh my God, I know somebody that I should be worried about?
No, none at all. It was more, I was hurt that he was asking questions about him, you know.
It was the last he'd hear from CSIS, but before the agent went away, he had a quiet warning.
Before he went away, he said, I hope you're going to keep this confidential. And I said, you should have told me that before we had this conversation, because then we wouldn't have had the conversation, you know. And I'm about to phone my friend Stefan, and are they bugging his phone?
It was completely unacceptable what they did. It's something that irks you deeply. When they mention details about your life, intimate details, I think it's quite grotesque, to be honest.
CKUT 90.3 FM, this is World Skip the Beat. It's just after noon.
He would learn that CSIS called on 7 of his friends. Most felt threatened. All but one felt too vulnerable to talk to us about the visits.
You know, on the record, CSIS will always say that you're not obliged to speak to CSIS. But when the agents are in practice, they force themselves, you know, not in a physical way, but you can do a lot of forcing through the tone of your words and your demeanor. And I think they're very well trained in that.
Could this have been the reason for the interest in Christophe? The G20, the economic summit of world leaders in Toronto in late June. This would be one show that Stefan Christophe wasn't going to miss, a rare opportunity for dissent on a global platform. The visits to his friends, the indiscreet inquiries, could have been designed to send a message. We'll be watching you. CSIS has declined to clarify. So CSIS would say, what's your problem? We're just asking questions. Reporters ask questions, you ask questions, you've taken a side in a debate, and we have questions. So?
There are many sides to political debate, but a secret government spy agency shouldn't be a legitimate side to that political debate. I want to live in a society where we discuss issues openly, publicly, right? It makes you angry. And when they start intervening in a way that, you know, you would imagine happened in another era, or it seems like it's from a spy novel.
The best spy stories are the ones we never hear about. Nothing happened. People spied upon are most often none the wiser. But as a boy, Jim Laxer always felt his family was being watched. In time, he forgot about it. Nothing happened. Times changed. Now he knows about the Profunk operation and finds himself reliving juvenile anxieties, seeking answers to questions that he couldn't even have articulated more than 50 years ago.
What should we, when we put all those things together, how should we regard what's going on around us now?
I think we got to regard it with very real concern. And I think what we have to do is to try to deconstruct this kind of surveillance state that's being put into place.
He has asked the RCMP, the CIA, and Canada's National Archives for access to files collected in the years of spying on his family. Chances are he'll be in for a long wait. Profunk was a 33-year program that monitored tens of thousands of unsuspecting Canadians at unimaginable cost. Officially, it never happened. If you suspect that you or a member of your family might have been a target for detention or even a person of interest under the Profunk plan, you can go to our website for information on how to proceed. Or you can go directly to the RCMP, CSIS, or the Canadian Archives with a formal request for access to files. A caution: don't hold your breath while waiting for results. Welcome back to the Fifth Estate. If you'd like more information about our stories, you can visit our website at cbc.ca/fifth. This week we have some special details about how to reach the government if you're seeking security records about yourself. We show you which agencies you may wish to contact and how to do it. A look now at some stories we are preparing. Next week, Gillian Findlay reports on a rash of unsolved murders in Alberta.
They came from the toughest neighborhoods of Toronto, lured to Alberta, the promised land of money and jobs. But for too many young Somali Canadian men, it's where they came to die.
31 bodies? Is that normal? Unsolved?
This is the story of one of those young men.
Then they said, Abdel Nasser is dead. I said, what? Abdel Nasser is dead. Where? In Alberta. No.
The story of one family.
I just want to go home safe now. I hate this place.
It's the story of a dream gone very wrong.
We know the person that shot, that pulled the trigger.
Coming soon, the life and death of Abdi Nasser Deary.
I'm afraid for my life, I am.
For your life? I'm Hannah Gartner with a story Corrections Canada does not want you to see.
There was an inmate beaten quite badly, and one of the security pulled me aside after and said, if you go to court, you didn't see anything.
Punishing the mentally ill.
Inhumane treatment, forced chemical restraints, solitary confinement for months on end. This is torture.
It's a cover-up. They are not giving us information. This has to be public.
Coming soon on the Fifth Estate.
Don't forget to visit our website. It's at cbc.ca/fifth. And another way to know what's going on at the Fifth Estate, you can find us on Facebook and on Twitter. That's our program for this week. I'm Lyndon McIntyre. Thank you for watching. We'll see you soon.
Saturday, doubleheader action on CBC's Hockey Night in Canada. Alfredson and the Sens take on Camilleri and the Habs. Later, the Battle of Alberta as the Flames clash with the Oilers. It all starts at 6:30 with Scotiabank Hockey Tonight, Saturday. Sunday, how high will they fly? How low can they go?
I would have split my pants right down the middle and blown 2 hamstrings if I would have tried that.
An all-new Battle of the Blades, Sunday at 8 on CBC. On the next All for One, will faith save the day?
Is this the crew for construction or for interior decorating?
All for One with Debbie Travis, Sunday at 9 on CBC. CBC News The National starts now.